"What can I do for you, Dr. Whitmore?" Alan Whitmore let himself sink into the low chair across from his mentee, and gaze appreciatively around the office. Rory couldn't help but follow his gaze, tensely waiting for any sign of disapproval. Dr. Whitmore had been a professor when Rory was in university. He had taken Rory under his wing and encouraged him, and for that, Rory would be forever grateful. While Rory had enjoyed his work for the city following his time in university, especially his work on the garden, the draw of working alongside Dr. Alan Whitmore again had been more than enough to bring him to the private sector and Cardinal Enterprises. "I wanted to congratulate you in person," Whitmore said warmly. "Welcome to the team. Dr. Abrahams can be a difficult personality to work with, as I'm sure you've heard. But I know you'll excel here, Dr. Lawrence." Rory laughed. "Leave it to Dr. Whitmore to get straight to the point. I've been reading up on him and watching his more recent interviews. I think I see what you mean. Dr. Abrahams intended to come and welcome you himself, but I asked if I might do the honors. You've grown a lot since the young student I met years ago. You should be very proud. I know that I am." "Thank you, Dr. Whitmore," Rory said, blinking back a wave of emotion that had crept up on him. "That means a lot to me." He didn't trust himself to say anything else. Dr. Whitmore coughed gently and cleared his throat. "Let's get down to business. I'm sure you've got questions about your place on the task force." A jolt of excitement shot through Rory, chasing the dewy emotion from his eyes. "I've been anxious to learn more. Everything has been so secretive so far. I almost didn't take the job, to be honest with you. You'll be glad you did, Rory. You did good work for the city. You really made a name for yourself with your work on the garden, but here at Cardinal Enterprises, everything you do will be on the cutting edge. No more worries over funding or resource allocation." "Why all the secrecy?" Rory asked without thinking. "I haven't received anything yet about projects or introductions or—" "Most of the instructions you receive will be in person from now on. Confidentiality is key. You'll get used to it." "That seems a bit inconvenient." Dr. Whitmore laughed dryly, but his face quickly became more serious. Suddenly, Rory was transported back to his intro to astrobiology course, and Dr. Whitmore was again the stern professor, settling in for a lecture. "It is a bit inconvenient, I suppose. Dr. Abrahams is a busy man, but he makes time for this task force. You'll get used to all the secrecy, Rory. I know it's a bit disconcerting at first. Things will make more sense to you once you've met the rest of the task force. We meet weekly, in a randomly rotating conference room. You've just missed this week's meeting. How will I know when and where? Abrahams will send you the location of the meeting, usually about an hour or so ahead of time. You'll have to get used to short notice on this task force." Rory leaned back in his chair to absorb Dr. Whitmore's words. The secrecy, the paranoia. It all seemed a bit much and didn't set right with him. He tried to push his doubts aside. It was just different from his work in the public sector. If anything was wrong, Dr. Whitmore certainly wouldn't be caught up in it. "In any case," Dr. Whitmore continued, with a sly smile creasing his face, "we don't want you to sit here twiddling your thumbs all week until the next meeting. Tell me, you've heard of the Paradise Convention, yes?" "Have I?" Rory leaned forward in his chair, and his heart danced in his chest. He tried desperately to control his breathing. Any previous doubt was forgotten. "Of course I have. Who do you take me for, Dr. Whitmore?" "Excellent, excellent. You'll have a chance to meet Dr. Abrahams and one of your new esteemed colleagues tomorrow at the rail station." "At the rail station?" Rory didn't dare to hope, but his heart fluttered again. "I remember you being very intelligent when you took my courses, Dr. Lawrence," Whitmore said sternly, but there was a twinkle in his eye. "Do try to keep up. Unfortunately, Dr. Woods has come down with a stomach bug, so you're going to the Paradise Convention this weekend in her place." Rory's head was spinning. The annual convention of Mars' best and brightest, held in the capital city. He'd dreamt of attending, dreams so real that he woke crushed and despondent. "Thank you, Dr. Whitmore," he breathed. "Thank you." Whitmore smiled. "Don't thank me. You've earned this." The following afternoon, after a quick stop in the cafeteria to say goodbye to Eden and soothe her jealous feelings with the promise of a souvenir, Rory left the campus behind and set off for the rail station. The streets were packed with foot traffic, but Rory had packed lightly, and it was easy to weave through the crowd with his head down. He walked until he reached the garden's north entrance and hesitated fondly at the gate. Just beyond, a lush lawn of vibrant grass, dotted with flower beds and burbling fountains, beckoned to him. HI's favorite project had grown into his favorite place in the city. Even from the gate, he could hear the happy gurgling of the central fountain and the easy chatter of the people milling around, enjoying the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the dome above. Adjusting his bag on his shoulder, Rory took one last whiff of the gentle artificial breeze that was always whispering through the garden to settle his nerves, and he turned towards the rail station. It was not a long walk from campus to the rail station in the heart of the business district of the city, but it was enough to have Rory out of breath by the time he arrived. He hesitated at the top of the steps that lead down to the underground railway that connected Haven to the capital and, from there, the rest of the planet. Rory had never left Haven before. The thought paralyzed him for a second at the top of the steps. The closest he'd ever come was the field trip to the farm, and then down into the forgotten mines that every child of Haven took in their school days. It was strange to think that, in a matter of hours, he would be beyond the dome that had ensconced him all his life. Steeling himself, Rory plunged into the permanent twilight of the rail station. The train itself, a 3-car, impossibly fast bullet designed by the city and enhanced by Cardinal Enterprises, was gleaming beside the boarding platform, waiting impatiently to carry her passengers to Paradise. It was quiet at the station and mostly deserted. A small group of shadowy figures was waiting on the platform, dimly illuminated by the glow of the lights on the track that disappeared into the tunnel at the end of the station and the too bright display screen showing that everything was running exactly on time. His footsteps echoed through the cavernous room, but none of the figures turned to him until he had nearly joined them. As he approached, one of them turned to him, a woman who he immediately recognized as Dr. Sabrina Harper, another software engineer who had worked beside him designing the automatic hydroponics for the garden. She smiled brightly when she saw him approaching. He'd forgotten how brightly she smiled, and turned away from her 2 companions, who remained locked in discussion. Rory felt the blood rush to his cheeks when she extended her hand to him as he joined the group. "Dr. Lawrence," she said warmly, "I'm not sure if you remember me. We collaborated on the garden project, but it's been a while. 5 or so years, if I remember correctly. I'm Dr. Harper. Of course I remember," he finished quickly. "Please, call me Rory." "Sabrina," she replied. Her warm honey-colored eyes flicked down to their still-clasped hands. Rory's cheeks warmed again as he released her hand. "Let me introduce you," she said with a smile, turning to the 2 men locked in conversation behind them. She coughed delicately, and the others finally turned to them. One of them was a card, a platinum-haired man that Rory instantly recognized as Hal Cook. The image of Eden perched on the corner of his desk with a fat lip was still fresh in his mind. His fists clenched at his sides, and he hastily buried them in the pockets of his suit pants. He glowered at Hal, until the card raised his eyes to meet Rory's. Rory quickly shifted his gaze to the other man, a familiar-looking man who Rory could not quite place. Dr. Harper Sabrina, he corrected himself, began the introductions. "Dr. Rory Lawrence, this is Dr. Jason Abrahams, our fearless leader." Abrahams was a stern-looking man, all sharp lines and harsh angles. Rory, his mind clouded just as badly by Hal's presence as Sabrina's, finally recognized him from his bio on the Cardinal Enterprises intranet. He smiled at Rory, but the action seemed unpracticed. The result was more grimace than grin. His brow seemed permanently furrowed. "Welcome to the team, Dr. Lawrence. I've been watching your career with much interest over the last years, and I look forward to seeing what you will bring to the team." "Good to meet you, sir." Rory tried to keep his voice steady and professional. "You won't regret selecting me." "I should hope not," came the humorless reply. "And this is—" Sabrina hesitated, turning to Hal.
"Hal Choki," Hal interrupted.
"Card Force. A little extra security never hurt anyone," Dr. Abrahams explained, mistaking Rory's attempt at a menacing glare for confusion. "Pity the hive scum that tries to make trouble with me," Hal boasted, touching the laser weapon at his side and flexing simultaneously. "Are we expecting trouble?" "Always," Abrahams replied. He looked suspiciously around the dark rail station. They were alone. His eyes lingered in every shaded corner. Every step forward that Cardinal Enterprises makes gives the hive another reason to cause trouble. An invitation to the Paradise Convention will have them buzzing. He lowered his voice. "Minister Yates is days away from awarding Cardinal Enterprises a contract for all Haven security needs," he said smugly. "You didn't hear it from me. Once that news breaks, the hive will be furious, and we'll need more than Hal to protect us then, but our cards are well up to the task. Let's get moving." Abrahams turned and knocked on the side of the train once. The door opened smoothly. He disappeared inside, leaving Hal with a half-hurt, half-confused look on his face. Rory jostled past him as he and Sabrina hurried to join Dr. Abrahams on the train. The rail car was plush and brightly lit, nothing like Rory had expected from the sterile metallic exterior. Dr. Abrahams had made himself comfortable at one of the tables that were bolted to the far side. After some hesitation, Rory set himself down across the table from Dr. Abrahams and was very pleased when Sabrina chose the seat beside him. His leg brushed against hers as she twisted to remove her coat. He shivered, trying to keep his mind on the weight of Dr. Abraham's words. The guerrilla attacks of the rebel group known as the Hive were a hot issue among Cardinal Enterprises staff, especially lately, and all of Haven. As the corporation expanded, buying up every plot of land on the farm, choking the life out of small businesses, and now taking on security contracts, the more the Hive pushed back. The strikes on agricultural shipments, labs, and warehouses were the only things standing between Cardinal Enterprises and a true monopoly on development in Haven. Rightly so, some said. Others pointed out the irony that Cardinal Enterprises' defense against the Hive's attacks had led to the highly profitable card security division, which had only ignited the fire more. Rory tried not to think of the more frightening tactics used by the Hive. Deep down, Rory could see why the rebel group was so angry, though he'd be treasonous to admit it aloud. Small farms, small businesses, and friendly commerce had been stomped down by profit-driven obsession. The same obsession that had broken down humanity's first home beyond repair. Rory could sympathize with the roiling anger in the city as struggling business after business closed down, making room for the enterprise to expand from one side of the dome to the other. Rory felt the ugly stare of Hal Cook from across the table, where he'd taken a seat beside Dr. Abrahams. What good was this bully in the name of protection? Rory would have felt more comfortable with a laser weapon in the hands of anyone else. "What's the matter, Dr. Lawrence?" Rory flinched at the abruptness of Dr. Abraham's voice. "Oh." Abraham smirked, possibly at Rory's discomfort, an action that seemed much more comfortable than his earlier attempt at a smile. "You seem deep in thought. Share with us." Rory hesitated. I suppose I was just wondering what we would be presenting at the convention. In all the rush, I just realized that Dr. Whitmore never. Presenting? What do you mean, Dr. Lawrence? Beside him, Rory felt Sabrina stiffen, and the air grew colder. Even Hal was aware enough to shift in his seat further from Dr. Abrahams. Abrahams chuckled, but his eyes were cold and hard. I've had this discussion with Dr. Harper once, so I suppose I'll have it with you as well. Once. Cardinal Enterprises is honored to accept a place at the Paradise Convention after so many years of being snubbed, and we will attend this convention to better expand our own horizons. To be inspired, one might say, by our sister cities. Regardless, we have no intention of disseminating our own hard-won developments for free, not after all this time. Let the fools they're allowing to represent the city of Haven make their presentation, and that will be enough. We won't be doing the same. Dr. Abrahams leaned back in his seat and folded his arms in punctuation of his point. "Oh," Rory said awkwardly, shuffling his hands in his lap and trying to ignore the bitter taste of disappointment. "I understand. You seem like an intelligent fellow, or so Dr. Whitmore assures me. You'll catch on quickly." They rode in uncomfortable silence the rest of the way to Paradise. When the train finally shuddered to a stop, Rory leapt up eagerly to stretch his cramped, lanky body. Hal was up just as quickly and took the lead, exiting the car first. Dr. Abrahams followed closely behind and did not acknowledge or apologize as he brushed past Rory. Sabrina Harper and Rory shared a look as the tension in the room followed Abrahams. Nervousness, excitement, and more than a little awkwardness hovered between them. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, smoothing the wrinkles from her dark pants. "As I'll ever be," he answered, suddenly aware of a prickle of electricity over his skin. They disembarked together, with Rory slinging Sabrina's bag over his shoulder along with his own. The two shared a gasp as they stepped out of the train and onto the brilliantly illuminated chrome platform. While the rail station in Haven was a dark shadowy hole in the ground, this was something else entirely. The underground platform was humming with excitement, with several groups of people. Rory assumed them to be representatives from other cities, standing around with their luggage. The air was stale and sedentary, but Rory breathed deeply regardless. Ahead, Dr. Abrahams and a scowling Hal were locked in an animated argument with a finely dressed woman near the steps leading up into the city itself. Her face was lined with wisdom accumulated over many years, and pinned to her jacket, she wore the golden emblem of a minister. Two reedy men flanked her. At first, Rory assumed they were security, even perhaps the Paradise equivalent of guards, but they were unarmed and their expressions were more bored than anything. As he and Sabrina crept up behind and rejoined the group, Rory felt Dr. Abraham's anger before he could make out the words of the conversation. "You have no use for your goon here," the minister said. "Send him away. This convention is intended for intellect only. No violence. And especially, there will be no weapons permitted in Paradise." Hal stiffened and made to step forward, but Dr. Abrahams put a warning hand on his shoulder and held him back. "No use. I beg to differ. Our safety." The minister, who had trapped Hal and Abrahams in her vice-like stare and had thankfully not yet acknowledged Rory or Sabrina, cut him off with a sharp voice and a dismissive wave of her hand. "Your safety is guaranteed by our own very capable security. Without the trouble drummed up by certain business practices in our dear sister city, you'll find that is more than enough to keep the peace here. Send your goon away. I won't have guests loose in my city with weapons." Rory's ears turned red as the minister's sharp rebuke echoed through the gleaming rail station. Dr. Abrahams was nearly shaking with anger. At Abraham's begrudging direction, Hal marched back to the train and boarded under the stern eye of the minister. She clapped her hands together brightly as he disappeared, and the fire in her voice gave way to warmth. As she spoke, the stone-faced men behind her visibly relaxed. "Now that this unpleasant business is taken care of, it is my pleasure to welcome you to paradise." Dr. Abrahams fumed as they waited at the station for the other delegations to arrive. Sabrina, braver than Rory by half, attempted to make conversation, but was met with only grunts from their fearless leader. The three settled into an uncomfortable silence on a bench just off to the left of the platform, their bags piled unceremoniously at their feet, as the Haven train, laden with a lone howl, retreated. The only delegations yet to arrive were coming from Utopia and Valhalla, the furthest cities from the capital, but they did not need to wait long for their arrivals. Rory cringed as he watched each delegation arrive and unload trunks and cases, each full to the bursting, he assumed, with presentations and treasured research. The measly pile of bags at his own feet felt inadequate, shameful even, and his cheeks flushed brighter with each arrival. "Now," the Minister of Paradise announced with a clap of her hands, "we've all arrived, so let me say once more, welcome to Paradise. We're ecstatic that you all could join us. Follow us to your accommodations, located conveniently next door to the convention center. We didn't want to see you. Well, those of you who also brought research to share, lugging your things up and down the street all day." Her eyes flashed to the Cardinal Enterprises team and lingered for a heartbeat too long. At this, Rory was sure that Dr. Abrahams, tomato-faced as he was, would burst, but he was silent as he and his cohorts fell into step with the crowd that ascended the gleaming steps and surfaced in paradise. On the surface, the city resembled Haven so closely that Rory questioned for a moment if he had left home at all. The rail station gave way to a business district, just as it did in Haven, and the streets were paved with the same rusty red Martian mixture as Haven's streets. The minister led them quite proudly down the sidewalk, her head held high, and as they walked, the stark differences in the two cities began to make themselves apparent. The storefronts were lively and bright, with workers calling out to passers-by to stop and browse, and clearly not all run by the same parent corporation. No, the businesses that lined the main thoroughfare were each different and colorful, unique in their own ways. The streets were busier, and the civilians who streamed around them wore smiles and left friendly greetings in their wake. Before long, Rory was overwhelmed by the infectious attitude of the city. Among the delegations who were following the minister to the hotel, Rory recognized Haven's scientists, a few familiar faces he had collaborated with over his time working for the city. That group kept a wide berth from the Cardinal Enterprises team, much to Rory's dismay. He noticed that they were dragging a well-laden luggage cart behind them, and again the shame of arriving empty-handed blossomed in his chest. He glanced at Dr. Abraham's stern face surreptitiously, but the man was scowling straight ahead, not even deigning to look at the streets around him. The minister led them around a corner, and the shops gave way to a plaza, centered around a fountain with fruiting trees growing out of dark soil around it. The plaza was an oasis of calm amongst the bustling city, ringed by a few quiet shops selling mostly desserts and souvenir trinkets by Rory's estimation. Directly in front of them rose a great monument of glass and steel. The hotel and its long shadow dominated the plaza. Beside the hotel was an unassuming squat building, which Rory assumed was the convention center. "Look!" He was jolted out of his observations by Sabrina's light tug at his arm. She was pointing into the shadow of the convention center, just beyond the fountain, where a man dressed in the brightest colors Rory had ever seen was humming a whimsical tune that sounded equally familiar and out of place. As they watched, the man produced a handful of balls from the bag at his feet, just as brightly colored as his clothing, and with speed and skill, he began juggling the balls until they were reduced to a rainbow blur. There could have been only 3 balls, or as many as 8. Beside him, Sabrina's jaw had dropped, and she made no attempt to hide her enjoyment. He wondered if she was so amazed at the performance, or if it was the lack of security hounding the man for performance taxes that amazed her. "Your accommodations for the weekend," the minister crowed, gesturing grandly to the hotel and ignoring the juggler who must seem commonplace to her. Just beside the Oasis Hotel, you'll find the convention center, where we will all gather tomorrow. Now, there will be enough time to see the convention center tomorrow morning. I know you're all, well, most of you anxious to get your exhibits set up, and we're quite excited to see them. For now, please take your time exploring the plaza and check in at the Oasis. At 7 p.m. tonight, please join us in the main dining hall for a welcome banquet. She paused here dramatically, letting the silence stretch on. And for a special presentation of our own. Oh! Sabrina exclaimed, nudging Rory in her friendly way that made his heart rate pick up. I wonder what that is. Come along, Abrahams said stiffly. Let's get checked in at their damned hotel. Wouldn't you like to explore the plaza at all, Dr. Abrahams? He simply glowered at her in response and took off towards the Oasis Hotel, leaving Rory and Sabrina to follow awkwardly in his wake. The other delegations had fanned out, exploring the Oasis Plaza. With one last longing look at the plaza, he and Sabrina stepped into the crisp air conditioning of the hotel. His room at the Oasis felt like luxury, with a small basket of fruits and candies waiting on the nightstand to welcome him in. The sheets on the single bed were inexplicably soft, and it took every ounce of his strength not to crawl between them and drift off to sleep. Instead, he tossed his bag onto the bed and quickly showered and changed into a fresh suit. He mused on the special presentation as he attempted to comb his damp curly hair into something resembling order. A knock at his door startled him. Half expecting the irritable Dr. Abrahams, Rory braced himself and opened the door. Dr. Sabrina Harper greeted him brightly. Her hair hung in damp strands around her face. It's almost time. Would you like to walk down to the banquet together? I knocked on Abraham's door a moment ago, but he didn't answer. He's probably gone ahead without us, Rory said, adjusting the cuffs of his pale blue shirt. He lowered his voice and joined her in the hallway. What's the matter with him? Is he always like this? I don't know, she whispered back, almost apologetically. I'm sure he's just tired. A bit embarrassed, too. They found their way to the banquet hall on the first floor easily. The room was already buzzing electric with dozens of simultaneous conversations. A dozen smaller round tables orbited a large semicircle table where the minister and her attendants sat, presiding over the representatives. Against the far wall, a table of fresh fruits and delicacies made Rory's mouth water. He scanned the room from the entrance, and his eyes found Haven's delegation again. He met the eye of a man he'd once collaborated with, and raised his hand in greeting, but the gesture was not returned. Oh, there he is, Sabrina said, tugging at Rory's sleeve and pulling him towards a table near the back that Rory's eyes had grazed over. There he was, indeed. Dr. Abrahams sat alone at the table, picking at the fruit on his plate with a sour look on his face. Dr. Abrahams, so sorry to keep you waiting. I didn't realize you'd made your way down here already, she said, taking a seat next to him. Rory breathed a sigh of relief, choosing the seat beside her and farthest from Abrahams. No matter, Abrahams said shortly. Sit. Rory cast a longing glance at the food on the side table, just feet away from them, but before he could gather the courage to stand again and make his way to the table, the minister began speaking. Welcome, one and all. The minister rose from her seat and spread her arms wide in greeting. Please, eat your fill and relax tonight. Tomorrow will be a busy day of exchanging ideas and sharing knowledge, just as our founders intended. I'll get right to the point, as I'm sure you're all tired from traveling. After much discussion, myself and my team have determined that unveiling this prior to the convention would lead to the least disruption. I know you're all excited to see what all the fuss is about, so I won't waste your time. Michael, bring out the sample. A finely dressed man carrying a cylindrical covered object emerged from the front of the room. Rory's heart quickened. Every eye in the room was on the object as it was placed gingerly, reverently, in front of the minister. The cylinder was draped in a heavy dark cloth that clung to its shape, roughly a foot tall, and narrow enough in diameter that Rory imagined he could easily grasp it. Without further ado, the minister whipped the covering away, revealing a glass container filled with viscous fluid. A shining, multifaceted pink crystal hung suspended within. At first glance, it seemed to be sparkling in the harsh light of the banquet hall, but that wasn't it. The crystal was pulsing, emitting its own light, and vibrating with a power that Rory could feel in his bones. Every hair on the back of his neck stood up. Sabrina gasped. The room quieted only for a second, and then was buzzing with murmured questions from the guests. Now. There will be time enough to answer every question, the minister said, chuckling. She waited, eyes twinkling, until the room quieted again. Behold, paradisium, a new organic mineral discovered earlier this year by our miners. Paradisium, to give you just a short introduction, will revolutionize all of your work. Every field will find it beneficial. This is an understatement. She smiled slyly, clearly enjoying this power that she wielded. Someday, while we in Paradise are excited to share this with you all eventually, until we have learned more, this will remain solely a resource of Paradise. What does it do? Someone called out. What doesn't it do? Paradisium conducts energy in a more efficient way, with practically no waste. Safer than nuclear, more powerful than electric or steam, more powerful than anything you've ever seen. I'm sure you all feel that charge in the air. That's the paradisium. The mineral not only conducts energy, but produces it as well. A lot of energy. Now, we haven't discovered all her secrets yet, but rest assured, there will be many opportunities to learn about paradisium at the convention tomorrow. With that, the minister swept from the room, taking her party with her and the pulsing crystal. As soon as the crystal disappeared from the room, the hairs on the back of Rory's neck lay flat again. Wow! Dr. Harper was the first to break the silence at their table, as excited chatter broke out in the room. Wasn't that something? Indeed, muttered Abrahams. The sour expression he had been wearing was replaced with something else entirely.